Head down, you gotta have tunnel vision just to break the crowd. Some people will always be a bit thick in the hair. Show out, well if you tell the truth they might scream and shout. You put in the work, now to knock them dead. And I hope that we can laugh it off someday. But the best things happen when you let them come your way, yeah. And I know that we'll laugh it off someday. So head down for now. Head down where there ain't a lot of love coming from your town. These people wish they could sing but can't carry a tune. Slow down, it doesn't mean you're wrong when you've got your doubts. Be patient, it's all coming soon. And I hope that we can laugh this off someday. But the best things happen when you let them come your way.
All right, well, I'm not sure what's happening here. If you can hear me, I apologize for the delay. Looks like it's being a little bit delayed here on our end, having some troubles. There we go. I guess it doesn't want to work quite properly for me tonight. Anyways, I'm Greg Staley of Diverge Media. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to have our next guest on. Jim Karahalios is leader of the New Blue Party of Ontario. But that is not why we're having him on tonight, because Jim is also a lawyer who represented Benjamin Dichter at the Public Order Emergency Commission. And during BJ's testimony, there was a bunch of different things that came up that, for those paying attention, I think was concerning. And we just want to probe some of these things a little bit more deeply. And we're excited to be able to bring Jim on and ask him some of these questions. Everybody, let's welcome Jim Karahalios.
Hey, Greg.
How you doing, Jim?
Good.
Good.
Sorry, go ahead. It's been like a year, and you got the setup now. You got the flag in the back.
Well, you know, you kind of stumble into things. You can't get worse, right?
So I'm in the inquiry last week, and I looked down at my phone at one point, and I see a message from you asking. I didn't know you were going to be there. So good for you. You're following it. Not a lot of people have time to follow like the 8 or 9 hours a day that were going on, and so much information is coming out of that inquiry, and the tidbits that get fed by the mainstream media or even the independent outlets is just a little bit, right? Like it's just really 1 or 2 quotes a day out of 8-9 hours of testimony and thousands of documents. So different stories could be said about all the stuff that's being put in place. So I appreciate the opportunity for you to talk to me about just 3 hours out of 5 or 6 weeks of witnesses that they're going to have there for 8 hours a day in Ottawa.
Yeah, and to put that in perspective for people, just 1 day of testimony, if you're looking at the text that they do, the transcript text is over 300 pages. So the amount of information that is coming out, it's like trying to drink from a fire hose. It is really hard to keep on top of. But there is some things that I think have been consistent that have emerged in the narrative. And that being, I guess I would say there's 2 narratives that are kind of emerging. One is that initially when the protest started, you had people from all over the country converging on Ottawa, excited to be there. It was excitement. There was, honking. And then that kind of died down and actually got better as things went on. And then there's the other narrative we're being fed, which is that it got worse as time went on. They lost control of groups, and then therefore justification of the EA. So I'm just going to leave that open for you to take from there.
Well, there's a couple layers there, and a lot of this stuff is layered. So as you know, I was not well in 2021, and I was back on my feet at the end of 2021 and started walking again in the fall. And 2 or 3 months later, we had the protests in Ottawa, and I was there first day on the ground, not as a lawyer, because I don't think I'd started practicing again. I was sick for almost a year and not practicing at that time, treating the tumor I had in my leg. But I was there in my capacity as New Blue leader, and we were able to set up the speakers and the mic on a flatbed on that first day, and Ezra participated and others got up there. And then our team kind of left early in the week, and there wasn't really an opportunity to go back with my commitments, and we were heading into applications for candidates. But we had a lot of people going in and out, and I was on the phone constantly with people participating in different levels, and obviously Ben Dichter was one of them. And so now we're at the inquiry stage, and it's, I think obviously from where we sit, like, they don't have justification, and they haven't proven that they had justification to call an emergency to clear out the protest in Ottawa. And a lot of that is, did they need to call a state of emergency at the federal level? And remember, the inquiry is not looking at what Doug Ford did provincially, calling a state of emergency, I think on the 12th. And then he really laid the red carpet out for Justin to do it 2 days later. But did he need that, or did law enforcement have the tools at their disposal to clear out the protest? So that's one question. And then, was it a matter of national security? But you're right. All these facts are being laid out now. And there is a concerning narrative, which is, and it's coming from, the people representing the convoy organizers, or they claim that they represent them. I'm not so sure that they're representing organizers, because what we know of the Freedom Corporation, if we can call it that, that was set up with 7 original directors to handle the fundraising, not to organize and control the protesters. And obviously they were able to develop some influence and stature in doing that. And then we have some representatives at the inquiry who claim to be representing that corporation, but almost half of the original directors aren't represented in that party for standing. And they're kind of, a couple of them last week when I was in Ottawa were pushing the idea that things got out of control, and it was too bad, and they were apologetic, and they were almost kind of giving the answer that, Justin had to call the emergency, and their defense is, but we had a deal with the city, so he went too fast. So they're conceding that they were trying to clear out. That's what they're conceding in the argument. And that came as a surprise to me last week when I was in Ottawa watching the testimony from my hotel and getting ready for Ben's testimony on Wednesday or Thursday, the 3rd. And to see that kind of narrative, which is, they're basically saying, yes, it was out of control, and we knew that, and we had to clear out, and that's why we secretly went to cut this deal with the city. I don't think it's a good argument, and it's not what they were telling us back then.
And there's a lot to unpack there. So much to unpack there. So part of that, you're talking about a deal, right? A deal was being struck, and this was partly, so we'll back this right up. The convoy legal counsel that was supposed to be representing your client, BJ, as well, seemingly went after him on the stand when it came up that he might have kiboshed this deal. That was kind of how they had narrated it, right? And they said, well, we had this deal in place, and it fell through because BJ hacked Tamara's account, broke into her account, they said, right? Even though he was the PR person, she had given permission, hacked into this account, and that said, there's no deal. And then we get into the information, and we'll pull some of these documents in here. He had received an email from Wilson. He said, looks good to me, but he was referring to what he believed to be a draft communication. This is my understanding from reading it, and we'll read it in the record here shortly. And then they take that to the city as the deal. And then there's text messages, not only on top of that, that you entered into evidence at the Public Order Emergency Commission showing between BJ and Mr. Wilson, that the lawyer for the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, there was no deal. That was not BJ's words. Those are Keith's words. So we're just going to give me a moment here. I'll let you take it away while I find these documents here.
Yeah, I can talk while you're looking for them. I mean, that was really concerning, obviously, for anybody. You know, you've got a national inquiry. All the media are watching. Many people, thousands of people across Canada are watching. And, you know, Ben was obviously, I don't know, concerned. I don't know how else to say it, more than concerned, when to see his former lawyer make a couple of allegations under oath against him. And, you know, let's be clear, Greg, like the reason if my friend, Mr. Wilson, I'm going to call him my friend because as a lawyer, you're supposed to be respectful, and I'm going to be respectful. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. And that's what we call each other in these legal proceedings. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But if he said anything like that, when anything you say at an inquiry is protected, okay? So it's like being in the legislature. You can't sue someone for what they say in an inquiry for defamation. So, you know, Mr. Wilson had free reign to say whatever he wanted under oath. But the protection is that you're hoping the individual is saying everything he knows to be true. So it was bizarre that at the very end of his testimony, and I think it crossed the line, that his entire story there, obviously we're paraphrasing, but he said that there was a deal with the city and they've been working on this deal to move trucks out, and it all fell apart from one tweet. And the part that went even further was to suggest that Ben knew about the deal, and you know, for some, I think the word that was used was sabotage. For some reason that's not disclosed, Ben just decided to say there's no deal. And, you know, on its face, it's ridiculous. First of all, if someone has that much influence that's involved with a protest, that one tweet can trigger the Emergencies Act, and one tweet can kibosh a deal.
Then why don't they have standing?
Wouldn't you bring that person to the meeting, right? Wouldn't you bring that person to the meeting of this deal that's going to solve all our problems? And then, you know, so if he said that outside of an inquiry, I think it's defamatory, what he said. The other thing that is troubling is that he was representing Ben in the class action, and in doing so, he's got privileged information about all of the defendants in that class action and all of the individuals that were directors on the Freedom Corporation. The other thing that was in his testimony that, you know, threw Ben under the bus was Mr. Wilson said he didn't know where the assets went that were raised.
And so we're going to get into all of that, but just before we get lost in the weeds here, let's pull in those documents, the email communications on the draft deal, I guess, deal in quotations with the mayor. And then we'll just pull those in and talk about it here. So it says, looks good to me. BJ sent that out. What is he referring to? This is the email. On February 12, 2022 at 15:47:25, Keith Wilson wrote, last night at the board meeting, the board directed that a drafting committee of Sean, Ryan, Ava, and Keith draft a document that would describe the Freedom Convoy's overall demands of all governments in a way forward. Hence, the drafting committee will keep working on the broader document for review by the board tomorrow. But in the meantime, below is a draft communication. And then here's the communications between Keith and BJ via text message.
Hold on, you got to back it up a bit, though. Go back to that. Go back. You're jumping ahead. Let's go through this email. So, you know, this is the email that they claim is notifying everyone that there was a resolution of the Freedom Corp Board of Directors. And pull it up again. We can look at it as we're going through it, because there's a couple really good lines in there that I think everyone needs to, everyone that's interested should look at. So first of all, a communications document asking for demands of the government is not a deal document. That's a PR piece that says of government, this is why we're here to protest, and this is what we want. And arguably, they had already been doing those in press releases, the protesters saying, We're here in Ottawa because we want to get rid of the ArriveCan app and all mandates, right? So this is some kind of other demand document, not a legal document, doesn't sound like, sounds like a press document or a comms document. And then further down there, it says, I think there's a line there that says, we'll circulate the updated version to everyone when it's finished, right?
I'm taking a look here. Arrange in the same way. This keeps going. No, that would be in here.
Go
right?
back to the email. No. It's in the email. We'll keep working on the broader document for review by the board.
Yeah,
right in that first line, the second paragraph. So what we got on the what we brought up in the inquiry, and you can go back and look at the video, is that no follow-up document was ever circulated to the board, and it was this draft or whatever. And the document they're referring to in this wasn't the letter that Wilson was later referring to as the deal document, right? And so they were kind of conflating two things together to throw this entire national emergency that Justin's saying happened, the prime minister saying happened, all at the feet of one guy and one tweet. And by conflating two things together, it was truly ridiculous. So Ben's testimony was he was against any kind of going first to discuss with the city some kind of a deal. And there's many reasons we can get into that why that's not a good idea and probably made it worse.
Yeah, we should touch on that later
but
because he was getting advice on why he thought this was a bad idea, right?
But the next thing you're going to go to is the text. And on the 13th, Wilson called Ben and they chatted and said, no, there's no deal. And on the 14th, he sent this message to Ben saying, no deal. And at the end of his message is more rumors.
And so I'll just read that in now. BJ to Wilson. I spent hours up until 1 a.m. being scolded by 2,000 of our supporters of Twitter Spaces last night for the letter to the mayor. It took a couple of hours, but finally got them on board and understanding. Dagny is trying to draft a press release today. She's being told by some lawyer that they are drafting something between Tamara and the city, and they won't tell us what is in it. I need your help to end this process. Keith's response back was, neither Ava nor I are drafting anything for the city. More rumors.
And more rumors suggest that's not one rumor, right? More rumors is obviously he's stating that there's rumors and they've been going on for a while. Maybe they were just going on that day, but that's fresh in the morning, 8 o'clock on the 14th. So, I don't know why that was said in testimony, but one thing's for sure. Ben's really, really lucky that he got called as a witness so we could straighten all this out, because if he wasn't called as a witness, the vast majority of people would have heard that testimony, and very prejudicial to Ben, like publicly, reputationally, in front of the protesters and in front of those across Canada that didn't support the protest. And I think it was totally inappropriate to provide that, but we were able in 3 hours to get on the record of the facts. And that was one of the exchanges in the facts. And then there was the whole other layer of, was there a deal? And of course, when you're talking about Doug Ford's buddy, Dean French, representing the truckers, that's not a deal. That's totally not a deal. So we can get into that as well, Greg. But if you have more questions about this deal or no deal, there was another document, another text exchange that we were able to pull up. And that was Tamara on the 14th also messaging Ben in the group chat that the directors and others that were protesting had. I think it was on Signal or Telegram. And she too said to Ben, I don't know anything about a deal.
Yeah, so that's the one. I don't have that one lined up, but I do know the one you're referring to. And I'm just pulling up Dean French's text messages to Wilson. This is where my stomach doesn't feel good. This is where I start to have some very serious questions for the council involved here. I'm not legally trained, full disclosure, but as a casual observer who's been watching these proceedings since day one, it bothers me because I can't quite put my finger on it. But again, I think BJ touched on this on the stand, and he goes, I don't understand why the lawyer who's allegedly representing, I'm paraphrasing, allegedly representing the protesters is meeting with the former chief of staff of the premier, who is arguably one of the worst offenders of lockdown mandates and policies. And he didn't, my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe you don't know, but he did not notify the organizers that he was in consistent, I wouldn't say constant, because there's over 87 text messages between them that were submitted to the POEC. So he was in consistent communication with Dean French. And what gets weird here is there's Randy Hilliers involved in this too. And we just released this because Tom Marazzo sitting down with Andrew Lawton of True North, and I'll play that after here. I have it lined up. 22nd of February 2022, I believe he sat down with Andrew Lawton of True North, and he said that Randy Hillier had called him saying he should strike a deal with the city. And then we have these private communications between Dean French and Keith Wilson.
And Tom.
And they're the same thing. It seems like they were saying the same things. I mean, and what gets weird, I have email communications. I'll be coming out with an article on it shortly where I messaged Mr. Hillier and I said, listen, I have it on good authority that there's other influencers that you message, not just Tom. And he accidentally slipped, I think, in his language because he referred to another male influencer and trying to defend himself. And I will post full communications shortly in the future. But ultimately, it wasn't a male I was referring to. It was a female. So that would mean he was in the ears of more than 2 people. It would be at least 3. And then it's the same communications. That's the takeaway here, that Dean French is feeding Keith Wilson, and that Mr. Wilson, to my knowledge, did not notify the people he's allegedly defending that he's in communications with the former chief of staff for Doug Ford. So I'm just going to play Marazzo's video quick. It's a couple minute clip, but I think it's important to get in here so it's not my own words and so that people can see for themselves.
Crossed with the city. And so, you know, there was a frustrating part in there.
Sorry, everyone.
Because you know, I received a phone call from Randy Hillier saying, look, Tom, I think you guys need to start dealing with the city to try to get the city off your back a little bit so you can put the pressure where it belongs and put it onto the parliament. And I agreed, and I had spoken to several people, but the first call I got about that was Randy.
So just pause.
So
I had spoken to several people, but the first call I got was Randy.
Agreed that was probably
Sorry, just a second here. Go ahead.
Spoken to several people, and we've learned, though, that Tom tweeted out during Ben's testimony, barely knows Ben, and they barely knows BJ Dichter. So think about this for a sec, right? Just back it up. We've got, and don't take that video because you're going to play the rest of it, but we've got Wilson saying that Ben Dichter doing one tweet collapsed an entire deal that led to the Prime Minister of Canada calling an emergency. Okay. That's how important Ben Dichter's social media skills were to this, right? But at the same time, you got Tom saying that he talked to several people about a deal with the city, and recently he said that didn't involve Ben because he's hardly ever talked to Ben. So how do you square that? How do you square a guy like Tom Marazzo coming in and saying you talked to a lot of people about a deal, but that didn't include the guy who was doing communications on behalf of Tamara on Twitter? Kind of weird, right? Don't you think that's weird? Don't you think he'd be like, I don't know, maybe person 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 on your list of people you talk to and say, hey, we're going to do this, but keep rolling the rest of the video because obviously it's really interesting.
We're going to pull up. And this is on Diverge Media. You can find it on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and check it out yourself.
Move to try to get the police in the city kind of off our back so that we could just keep the pressure on Parliament and stay on the front page of the newspaper to try to get our message across. And we almost got there. We were really, I would say, on like the 5-yard line with the police. And then last second, the police pulled out. And then there was a lot of people saying that we sold out and this, that, and the other thing. It's like, no, this was part of the strategy to try to put the pressure onto the government where it belonged and take it off of the city of Ottawa. So this was all part of the thing. And then, I was disappointed because immediately after, Randy Hillier had tweeted that the leadership of the convoy had made a deal with the city and abandoned the truckers. And it's like, you know what? You were the first person that actually called me and said I should be talking to the city. So that was pretty frustrating. We think that the strategy was very sound to be up on Parliament, but we recognized from the start that, let's say from a tactical point of view, and I want to be careful about using words like that. We knew that if we had moved up onto Parliament, up onto Wellington, we'd be in a more physically vulnerable position for the police to move in.
Okay. I'm going to pause it. There's 5 seconds left. That's enough of that. Okay. Let me bring in some context here. One of the people that was communicating with BJ, because remember, he's broken leg, he's hobbled, and he had runners. This came out in his testimony. Was a very experienced Canadian-Iranian protester that has been involved in many protests, named Salman Sima. Salman said to BJ about this alleged deal, draft communication deal with the city. He goes, listen, they want you to move into that area. I'm paraphrasing, but they want you to be in that area because you're going to be kettled in. It's going to be easier to get you, and they're going to come in, basically beat the crap out of you in mass arrest. And what happened? Exactly that. And what is Tom saying in this video? We recognized that was a possibility. That was a concern. And where did that idea come in his head, allegedly? From Randy Hillier. And what did Randy Hillier tell him? Make that deal with the city. And that deal is the same deal that Dean French was telling Wilson. You should make that deal with the city. And that's where this all flows together, and my stomach churns.
So we gotta go through the video, because that's one element of like 4 things that he said in there.
Yep.
First, that interview with True North was what, like March, April?
February, I believe it came out. February 22nd. I want
Like
to say
shortly thereafter, Tom Marazzo was running for Derek Sloan's party, right? Yeah. And Derek Sloan goes on this 2-month campaign about how terrible Jim Karahalios is because he's criticized Randy Hillier for making a deal with the Ontario PCs. And but here we've got Derek Sloan's star candidate totally dumping on Randy Hillier. But we don't hear anything about Tom Marazzo being divisive, right? That's the first thing I want to say. Second thing is, can you imagine if it was me or Ben Dichter who secretly went off to negotiate with the city to move trucks into Wellington? Can you imagine? I mean, Ben tweeted out the day after Tamara got arrested, and the road captain said they're leaving and they felt obligated because they didn't want anyone to get hurt. He tweeted out, I don't remember the exact tweet, but I'm pretty sure he said something like people should go. Okay. And it was unfortunate because Ezra Levant dumped all over him, and Mark Friesen of the PPC dumped all over Ben. Okay. Because apparently you weren't supposed to say that. You weren't supposed to say that. But now we've got, months later, Randy Hillier, star of the PPC, Tom Marazzo, going off and having negotiations with the city to exit early. The other thing that I don't understand here is he said that was the strategy to move everyone in the front of Parliament Hill and get media. And what else did he say? Like put the pressure on.
Put the pressure where, I think something to the extent of where it belongs, and on Parliament.
Off the city. Like, this is so crazy. Like, the protest was happening in the city of Ottawa. Like, what pressure were you going to relieve because you're going to move a bunch of people into the front of Parliament Hill? I don't know if Tom went on Wellington, but it was jammed. Like, there was no room. There weren't empty spots on the parking lot for people to drive out of the residential areas and park on Wellington. And then, the other thing is, who's we? He says that was the strategy. We decided. Who's we? Because it was pretty obvious from the testimony last week. It wasn't the 7 directors of the corporation, and it wasn't the guy that they said had control of Tamara's Twitter account. So who's we? And then we realized, in their own words, that we was Dean French, Tom Marazzo, and Keith Wilson.
Why don't I pull in the Dean French Wilson text messages now, just to keep this all relevant? and it fresh on people's minds. Again, I don't want it to be our words. I don't want it to be misconstrued. And this is all evidence that has been submitted to the Public Order Emergency Commission.
And Greg, as you're pulling the text up, you know what's amazing? I was looking on YouTube on my stream the other day. The National Post, okay, has like, you know, their video channel on YouTube, right? And I was looking at all the testimony that they had lined up, and they had Wilson, Marazzo, and then they skipped the spot where Ben Dichter's testimony was, like, written out of history, like as if he didn't even testify. I will apologize to the National Post if they put it up and I didn't see it, but I was scrolling through it and it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Ben's testimony. Do you know, like, it's one thing to come after me in a political campaign because we're going for votes. It's another thing for the media, whether it's the CBC or the National Post or anyone, independent journalists, to manipulate the message that's going out, to leave the testimony of Wilson out there for everyone to watch, and to prejudice and try to destroy a guy's reputation. And I don't care about his political beliefs, but it's outrageous. It crosses a line because now you're not in a political campaign. You're not there looking for votes. You're just trying to throw a guy under the bus because you're embarrassed and you don't want to get blamed for a terrible idea, which was to go with Dean French and try to cut some deal with the city and then come back to everyone after the fact and say that was their great plan for avoiding Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister, calling an emergency. So let's pull up the text that you were talking about and let's go through that.
So again, over 87 texts. This is a draft I have, but these are available on the Public Order Emergency Commission website. So let's start here.
So let's just start from.
Yeah, go ahead.
Here, okay. So Tom Marazzo did a tweet last week, okay, after Ben's testimony. And it was something along the lines of saying what COVID has shown is that most people think that they would stand up if they were living in Nazi Germany, but in fact, they would not. They would just go with the flow. And it was a graphic of a little girl standing in front of a line, right?
I've seen that, yep.
So he wants to be reflective, he said, okay? And he's comparing government mandates to what happened in Nazi Germany, okay? Fine. So let's go by his framework of how this works, because I don't agree that that's what's going on here, but let's go by Tom Marazzo and Keith Wilson's framework. And here we've got text messages where they're talking to the 30-year plus friend of the premier who put in these mandates and lockdowns, who admits in this text message that he has communication and can have communication with Telford, Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, and Ford. And he doesn't want any of the directors of the corporation, Freedom Corporation, to know that he's talking to the city and he's talking to Wilson. And so what is this? Is this Marazzo and Wilson's best impersonation of Neville Chamberlain? Because they're telling us that we're living in Nazi Germany times, right? And is their solution to this to go off on a private jet and meet with the Fuhrer and sit down and cede some land and cut a deal? Because you can't have it both ways. You can't be the hero that stuck it out to the end, but then months later come in after the fact and say, but you know what? We were really trying to cut a deal. You can't say on your Twitter feed, well, you could do anything you want, but you're not going to get away with it. Say on your Twitter feed, the institutions have failed us and no politicians will listen and blah, 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 and act tough like you were defending the protesters. But then when you were actually there, you didn't want anyone to know that you were working with Doug Ford's 30-year plus friend to move trucks into Wellington, as you said, not my words, as you said, some would say was setting them up to get quote unquote kettled, right? So which is it? Which is it? Were you trying to alleviate the pressure on the city, or were you trying to keep the pressure on in the protests? I'm not really sure. What's obvious to me, though, is they're trying to have it both ways, right? They're trying to have it both ways. They're trying to say they were there till the end, but at the same time, they were secretly negotiating with the best friend of the premier who put in the worst mandates in North America and lockdowns. And
this is French to Wilson here saying, please remind your board, I never once spoke with Premier Ford about this or Katie Telford, Juneau's chief, and he says Trudeau. So that was on the 13th of February, it looks like. I'm going to pop through a few here.
So he could have spoken to them, is what Ben said in the testimony. Sounds like he could have spoken to them, and
that language would be suggestive to that.
Either he didn't speak to them, and he could have bridged some kind of government or the province for a peaceful exit, and doesn't look like Trudeau or Ford were interested in that. That's the first thing. Or the other interpretation of this is he was talking to them, but he didn't want the board to know that he was talking to them. But anyway you cut it, Greg, what's obvious from this text is that they didn't want the protesters to know that Dean French was involved, right? They didn't want anyone to know that Dean French was involved. And that's what I think Ben was referring to when he said created a powder keg, like slowly mentioned, because as soon as word got out that French was involved, a lot of tension on the ground among the protesters, and it gave the opportunity to guys like Randy Hillier to start making allegations of selling out. But anyone there would have known, if you're using some good sense, you don't do a move like that. First of all, with Dean French, an establishment guy, friend of Ford's, and you don't do that without telling the protesters first, right? Getting buy-in from the protesters, because it'll backfire on you, and you could turn a peaceful protest into something else.
That's where I'll cut in, because that's where, like, how did you not notify the people you're representing? Hey, having communications with the former chief of staff to the premier about what? About moving protesters into Wellington.
So they, in their defense, their lawyer, when they were questioning Ben, said that there was a board meeting with a resolution to enter into a deal with the city, and he insinuated in the question that Ben was the only one against it. But that wasn't evidence. That was a question that I objected to from their lawyer. Now, the problem with that theory is we never saw, there was no evidence provided of meeting minutes of the corporation or a resolution stating here was the vote. We agreed to cut a deal. And then there was some discussion, I don't know if it was Wilson's testimony or someone else's, saying French came to a meeting and he met some of them. But I've talked to 3 of the directors, and I'm not aware that they were at that meeting. So who knows?
Marazzo talked about that. I could be mistaken. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of pages of testimony a day.
And then the other thing that Tom said in that video with Randy is he took Randy's advice, supposedly, to go and make a deal with the city. But Randy was the guy, after I left on February 2nd, 3rd, I was there that first weekend, whatever that weekend was, and I left. Remember the article of Randy moving the barricade and telling people to storm Parliament? Remember that? I
posted that, actually. I think it's underneath the Facebook video of the Tom Marazzo.
And most
there's that video of him removing that, and then there's another one where he says in a Peterborough protest, not at Ottawa, go get them, to a group of angry protesters who were surrounding the police after Maxime Bernier began to get ticketed. Took over 2 minutes for him to call the audience off, and then he actually went and got in a yelling match with the police, and that was then front page news all over the world to smear protesters.
So, and a lot of the protesters that I didn't see much like positive reaction to that, about Randy doing that. But why would Tom take the advice of the guy who was putting the pressure on with these, I don't know what you call these, antics that were discrediting the protesters? Is that the guy? He moves the barricade, he makes a spectacle, he calls you the next day, you know what, we got to alleviate the pressure. Go with Dean French and go negotiate a deal with the city. Greg,
I could be mistaken, but in that video, he's moves the barricade, and then I think he also had a physical assault against an officer charge. Okay. It looks like he brushed into the officer as he was kind of trying to move people. Anyways, he moved the barricade, and it looks like he kind of ushers people in, and in doing so, it looks like he made physical contact with that officer as well. So it's just, for anyone who's following this, what I've said to people, and I'm just offering context here, when people like that do stuff and they say they're part of your team, it makes it harder for the person that's trying to make sense and speak logic and truth and just get the true information out there. You don't need to sensationalize what's happened. You don't need to get over the top. Truth's on your side. But now you got guys like Randy Hillier doing stuff like this, and now I have to deal with being put in that same corner. And that's something that's happened again and again.
Maybe there's a reason why that happened, but I don't know. I'm just saying, I don't know if that's the person I would listen to after the fact in terms of strategic advice. But remember when I was telling you, when did we talk last? We did an interview here. Like, has it been a year? Or
I think it's been about a year or a little over.
Remember I said some people in provincial politics that look like they're opposing lockdowns and mandates have a deal with the Ford PCs. Remember when I said that?
Yeah, I do. And
people
I remember I remember this coming up in the interview, and then my communications with Hilliard confirming it.
Right. He got upset.
I mean, he said, to be fair, I'll actually read his full email because I have it set up here because I try to be prepared. He said, maybe you are uninformed of my bail conditions. I am not permitted to post on social media regarding the Freedom Convoy, nor am I permitted to encourage others to post on social media about the Freedom Convoy. He said, this permits many people to spread incomplete perspectives. He didn't say it didn't happen, but in reference to Tom, he says it permits many people to spread incomplete perspectives.
Yeah, and I've look, Randy can't talk about the protests and stuff, and he's moved on to politics, so I don't really want to talk about Randy Hillier. Obviously, we didn't have a good relationship there in the last year or two, but the only reason I bring it up is because I've mentioned that some people are operating in provincial politics with a deal with the Ontario PCs, and now it's coming out of their own mouth that they tried to have a deal with the people in charge. So it's not me. They're saying it under oath. They were working on a deal, and the people involved were Dean French, Tom Marazzo, Keith Wilson, and Randy Hillier.
Yeah, well, that came out after for full context.
Randy Hillier wasn't working on it. He recommended it.
Yeah, and then back into the text here. I mean, there's so much to go through tonight.
Let's get some water.
All right, we got second here. Idea, this is French to Wilson. How do you feel about the mayor sending a letter to Tamara in the morning, which also helps define her as the leader she is, suggesting he meet with her group after a sign of good faith that trucks begin to move off residential streets? This is the whole idea of this draft communication essentially coming forth from Dean French.
But that's not the communication they mentioned in the email on the 12th, right? That communication on the 12th is demands. And this is something different that we haven't seen contemplated by the board in any other piece of evidence filed at the inquiry. So an interesting idea from Doug Ford's buddy, but we've never seen, we saw something that Wilson presented as evidence, or at least his lawyers did at the inquiry, which was a final quote unquote deal. And they went after Pat King, believe it or not, to say, why'd you say there was no deal? And Pat King actually made some interesting observation. I didn't see Tamara's signature on this quote unquote deal letter document. You'd think that was like a basic requirement of any kind of thing from Tamara is her handwritten signature. So it was interesting to see Pat King just state the obvious.
I'm trying to dig through these communications. There's a lot. So this is kind of referring to tweet after the deal, right? The no deal, the draft communication put out. He goes into Tamara's account, says there is no deal. He's in communication. We brought those text messages up earlier, or he messaged Keith directly, said, no, there isn't a deal. Maybe I should pull that up again here just for a reminder. I'm going to lose it again. Neither Ava nor I are drafting anything for the city. More rumors. And then we have, I hope Trudeau isn't using this misunderstood tweet to his advantage at tonight's cabinet meeting and getting a vote for the Emergencies Act. So referring to the tweet, and you talked about one guy being thrown under the bus. Like apparently he's the whole reason the EA was invoked. But there's the communications from French basically suggesting it. I don't know who had the idea first because I'm unsure of the timeline. But there's the communications.
So let's back it up now. So now this is the problem with the way that the party that says they're representing the Convoy Corporation, even though they're not representing half of the original directors, the approach they're taking at the inquiry, which is to say that we had a deal and they just needed more time on a deal and they wouldn't have needed the Emergency Act, and then kind of changing it and saying we had a deal and then it fell apart because this tweet. But let's back it up here. Like, what happened in February and January when Keith Wilson was telling us all that a judge ruled it was a legal protest? That's what they were publicly saying. And the original starting point in all this was, why did you need the Emergency Act when this was a peaceful legal protest? And that somehow has changed now with the inquiry testimony last week to, we knew that it was a problem and it was chaotic, and we did our best to cut a deal and move people out. We did our best Neville Chamberlain impression to move people out and end this protest. But it all fell apart because we couldn't control everybody, and there was one guy on Twitter. No, like what happened to this was a peaceful protest, and you don't call an emergency act, and there's no national emergency, and it's not a security a threat to national security. What happened to that argument? Because that's not being presented, and that's what we were saying, or at least we were being told for months and months on end, and it's changed all of a sudden at the inquiry, and that's even more concerning because you're almost giving the justification for the commissioner to write a report saying he had no other choice, because as the witnesses from the convoy, Mr. Wilson said and Mr. Marazzo said, things got out of control and they couldn't do anything about it, and they tried to cut a deal, but no one would listen to them, and they're the good guys, but Justin Trudeau had to do it. That's what's so I'm so bewildered by this approach that the convoy party is taking, because they're the ones from the 16, 17, 18 parties that have standing. They're the ones that are supposed to be challenging the justification of the emergency and the justification of bringing in the horses and running people over. But instead they're saying, well, we understand why that had to happen, because we had this deal and we couldn't fulfill the deal. And there was two tweets that went out, and we did our best. And here's the other thing. Let's just back it up here. Greg, if someone showed up in Saskatchewan tomorrow and said to you, I'm here on behalf of Jim Karahalios, and I'm here to negotiate with you on behalf of Jim. And would you say, yeah, okay, great. And Jim wants 10,000, and the guy says to you, here's 10,000. He wants $10,000 from you, and Jim would give you his house. And would you sign the check? Here's 10 grand. Yeah, this guy says he's representing Jim. Here's 10 grand. You wouldn't do that, because the first thing you'd say is this guy really here representing Jim? Maybe I should call Jim and say, hey, Jim, are you trying to sell your house? And this guy showed up that I don't know in Saskatchewan. So this is the mayor and the former chief, right? Dean French showed up, Doug Ford's buddy of 35 years, who said in the Toronto Sun in the middle of all this, I don't support protests on public property. He's saying that publicly, and he shows up, not a trucker, not involved from the beginning, and he's joined by Tom Marazzo, not there in the first weekend, not one of the 7 directors of the Freedom Corporation, and Keith Wilson, who also showed up after the first weekend, and now they're supposedly representing not only the Convoy Corporation, the Freedom Corporation, but all protesters, the thousands of them on the street. Come on, it's just ridiculous. What was the mayor thinking and the former chief of police to think, yes, these 3 are the representatives and they can persuade the truckers to a peaceful resolution? They didn't even try. They didn't even try to say, who's that guy doing the Jordan Peterson interviews? What's his name again? Dichter? Where's he in all this? Can you guys bring him in a meeting? Maybe we could call him. Where's Tamara? Can you guys bring her in? Where's Chris Guerra, the guy that was running the Adopt a Trucker a fundraiser? We heard our police were in contact with him the first week he showed up. Maybe we can talk to him. And you're trying to tell me that these guys were operating in good faith to try to strike a deal? Come on.
When French says, I don't believe in protesting or honking on residential streets.
So there was no deal. There wasn't even a negotiation, because the people going weren't representing the protesters. And as much as Andrew Lawton and the Rebel want to say Keith Wilson and Tom Marazzo representing the protesters, they not only weren't representing the protesters, they didn't even have the moral persuasion to speak on behalf of the protesters. And for them to go there and suggest that they could do a discussion like that and a deal on behalf of thousands and thousands of people on the ground is crazy. They did not have that buy-in from people on the ground, and that was all revealed in the testimony that Ben gave last week. And it was unfortunate, because what triggered all this was testimony on Wednesday trying to throw Ben under the bus, and then Tamara testified after Ben and backed up what Ben was saying, that he didn't know about any negotiations, and he does a great job on social media, and he had control over Twitter account.
And the back that is there's a more, the other accusation that came out against Ben when he was thrown under the bus was on the crypto, that he has this money or something, like that keeps resurfacing. But as you pointed out to me in affidavits, it's in escrow. He sent it to an agent acting on behalf of Keith Wilson. And then Keith said, I never received it.
So Keith Wilson was representing most, if not almost all, but not all of the defendants in the class action, right? I think there was a couple that he wasn't defending, and it started with the lawsuit was filed in the beginning of February, and then there was the injunction on the honking, and the judge made an order on that to stop the honking. And then there was the freezing of the assets by the Attorney General of Ontario. So the Premier of Ontario, the Attorney General, his cabinet minister, got an order to freeze all of the funds that were being raised, plus the bank accounts of many of the protesters. Okay. So as this is going on, Dean French is talking to Tom Marazzo and Keith Wilson, Doug Ford's 35-year friend, negotiating some kind of a deal. So after that Mareva injunction, it's called, the freezing of the assets, I don't think it was that much, but I don't have the number right in front of me, but that seems like a high number. There was a series of Mareva orders of the court freezing the assets, and then it went into escrow, and the defendants worked with the court, and there was a court-approved escrow agent, and that's where all of it is. And this is all public record. Now, public, I mean, it's in the court, so anyone can go to the court and ask for the records. Most people don't. I get that. But what's concerning about it is that Keith Wilson was representing them, and he had an Ontario lawyer working with him on that, and they're the ones that prepared the affidavits on behalf of not just Ben, but on behalf of all of them, the defendants that had some kind of control over assets, whether it was passwords to Bitcoin, whether it was bank accounts or Stripe accounts. And all of it got turned over to the escrow agent, and affidavits were submitted, signed by the lawyers representing the defendants. And Ben had only one of the 5 passwords, and you need 3 for that Bitcoin fundraiser to access the Bitcoin. And he handed the one password he had over to the lawyer working with Keith in defending him. That statement that he said in an inquiry, that he doesn't know what happened to the Bitcoin, he would never say on your show, on the Rebel, or anywhere, because when he says it at the inquiry, he's protected from any kind of defamation allegation against him. But here, saying it on your show, he's got no protection doing that.
And just to add to that, I reached out to Mr. Wilson, and there was 2 caveats. He said he might be open to an interview in the future, again, paraphrasing. But there was 2 caveats. He wouldn't talk about Bridget Belton, and he wouldn't talk about Benjamin Dichter. Those were his words.
Yeah, well, it's quite clear why. Because you say something like that, and you say stuff about he knew about the deal, and he blew it, and he sabotaged. You could say that in inquiry, and you can have loose lips, because you can't get you can't be held accountable in the court of law for that. But if you say a statement like that outside of an inquiry on an interview, and it's not true, or it's found that it's not with what the facts actually show, then you're running into the space of defamation. And that statement was very defamatory of Ben, and we see the trolls online continue to do that. And it wasn't just against Ben, right? That kind of defamatory stuff was going on against Tamara and Ben from the beginning. And you kind of get it, right? Because people see big money being raised in a short period of time. And, some people just can't control themselves. So they start attacking the fundraisers. But
naturally suspicious, right?
But it's a whole other level when your former lawyer is giving that testimony, saying, I don't know. And he's the one that submitted the affidavit on your behalf and held the password to the Bitcoin on your behalf and gave it into the court, or at least his agent, his legal agent that was working for him.
Can I pull that record in? I need to ask because it might be confidential. It's the injunction, or sorry, the Mareva injunction, the affidavit on the crypto around BJ. You sent me the images earlier. Yeah,
they're public documents. They're legal documents.
I wasn't sure. I just wanted to verify. All right, the Dichter and St. Louis cryptocurrency. This is the affidavit you're referring to, or one of. The multi-signature wallet. The extension and escrow order provides that Mr. Dichter Mr. St. Louis are required to provide their seed words for the relevant cryptocurrency wallets to the escrow agent. Following the granting of the escrow order, a search warrant was executed on Mr. St. Louis. Various seed phrases for certain of the cryptocurrency Mareva assets were seized. As a result, Mr. St. Louis was not able to provide the seed phrases in his possession to the escrowed agent. Mr. Dichter was in possession of the second set of seed words for the multi-signature wallets to effect the transfer of the cryptocurrency. Although he initially provided the seed phrases to his counsel, pending a resolution, Mr. St. Louis' seed phrases being provided to the escrow agent, Mr. Dichter provided the seed phrases to the escrow agent on March 8th, 2022.
To his counsel, yeah.
To his counsel.
So, look, it's a shame, man. Like, I don't know what else to say. I got retained by Chris Guerra and Ben Dichter. Chris Guerra, Adopt a Trucker fundraiser. I got retained by them back in August to represent him in the class action. And we've been working on that file. And Greg, like, we've been, I'm not advertising since August. Hey, I'm a lawyer for the truckers. Hey, we're on the class action defending the truckers. We're playing it, straight, right? Like, we're going through the court proceedings and trying to prepare documents and do our best defense for these guys and get up to speed. And we're not taking jabs at the other defendants. But then in this inquiry,
to back that up, that's a very good point, right? Like, even if they're not your clients, by making the other clients that are also defendants of the protest, like protesters, look bad in any way, shape, or form, it could be argued that you're making your own cause, your own clients look bad by default.
Well, that's your point. I wasn't, I didn't think of that, the perception out there, but I guess the point I was trying to get at is we kind of had our head down. Ben was getting ready for his testimony. We were working on the class action, getting up to speed on the facts. And then out of the blue, the day before, we're in Ottawa, and this guy's like trying to throw his own team under the bus, Mr. Wilson. And it's just such a shame. Like, I don't understand why they had to inject that. And then the next day, of course, Ben's going to try to clarify the record and defend himself. And we've got Tom Marazzo saying there's division. There's so divisive. Like, come on. You guys, it's a cute little tactic to say, we could take jabs at others, but if you defend yourself, you're being divisive. But at some point,
when I reached out to Marazzo, he came back with, because he's saying similar thread. We need to be united, and this kind of raw speech, and I don't want to talk about BJ, and I don't want to talk about Stand for Thee, which is Bridget Belton is kind of tied into that. And there's some accusations leveled from that organization against Mr. Wilson as well. I'm not going to get into those because I haven't studied them. I don't know much about them.
Yeah, it's not good.
Again, saying we don't know, and we won't.
Yeah, but absolutely. Like, you can't use that card of you can't create division when someone's, well, you can do anything you want. I said, but you should be prepared if you're going to use that card. You can't sow division if you're the one throwing the first blow. If you want to try to make an allegation against someone and you can't back it up, and that person's defending themselves, you better be ready for it. And they weren't ready, and they didn't back it up, and they didn't provide testimony that was very good. And we only scratched the surface on it. I know that. Look, Ben Dichter's got a book, Honking for Freedom. You could go on the line, honkingforfreedom.com or .ca, I can't remember. And that's not the focus. This is not the focus of his book, what we're talking about right here. This was all brought to light because the day before Ben's testimony, we had some people presenting facts or presenting opinion that didn't line up with the public record and the facts as to what was going on. And we're going to have to do our best to get the truth out and defend him not only legally, but reputationally.
And just to kind of give a 10,000 foot view, my perception of what I'm seeing is it looks, again, this is opinion, but the only caveat difference I've seen between the government lawyer narrative and what I'm seeing out of the Justice Center is, but the threshold wasn't met. It seems almost they've given up all the ground. Yep, you're right. It started okay. It got worse. We lost control. but the threshold wasn't met. That is the only difference I can see as an uneducated person watching that. I don't have a legal mind, right? I'm not trained in law, but I don't see much difference between the two arguments other than the caveat at the end where it says, but the threshold for the EA wasn't met. Well,
Yeah,
so
I
it
think
just
there was a
bothers me. It just seems so much of this narrative keeps falling in line with what the government's putting out too.
And we did we did a very good job. I think when we only had 2-3 hours, we're supposed to have 2 hours. I think we stretched it to 3 with Ben, but we were able to get some things out that I don't think that I haven't seen other parties doing as good of a job as I had hoped they would to get it out. First of all, this idea that the honking was being celebrated online, I think we were able to make very clear that the hashtags honk or use of the term honk really became popular after they filed the injunction and went to court, and people were replacing honking on the street because they wanted to abide by the injunction with honking on social media. And that's not really being defended much, because all we hear out of the inquiry is the honking was violent and the honking went on and on and on. The other thing is, after the injunction went in place, I'll say sorry, or I'll correct myself, but we haven't heard of many examples of people being arrested or sued because of violent acts, right? And that was the narrative for many months from the conservative talking heads and independent journalists, was there was no violence going on. So now why are we seeing this other defense of the protest at the inquiry, which was, well, it got chaotic and it was out of control, and the only thing we could do is try to move the trucks and cut a deal, and that didn't work because I didn't have control. It's a shame, and there's so much contradiction in what we're hearing.
Just to back that up, though, you talked about the hashtag honking taking over. That was brought up in the commission. They're like, tried to act as though it was a continuation because people were honking,
right?
And they were going on social media, and it came out, no, when the injunction came in, that honking stopped, and that was correct me on the day, like February 3rd, 4th, 5th, somewhere in that range. And then they went online, and it was almost like a joke. Well, like, okay, with the injunctions, then we're not going to honk. Hashtag honk honk. And that started to become very popular on social media after the honking stopped.
Yeah, I mean, Ben in his testimony said that the honking hashtag on social media got popular after the injunction was put in place. People replaced honking on the street with honking on social media. So those are the kind of things that I was hoping that we'd see a better defense of from some of the parties that have standing at the inquiry, and it's unfortunately not the case. And we're getting down to they're getting into the weeds of how could you have ended the protest? And then, like we said, the overarching thing is also the obvious is not being stated over there, which is, until I think maybe today it brought up, no one from the Prime Minister's office or the Premier's office tried to de-escalate the situation or come up with a peaceful resolution of this. And that's outrageous. I mean, it's one thing to have the mayor and the chief of police negotiate with the wrong person, or the person not really representing the protesters, the person representing Doug Ford. That's one gaffe. But then the other gaffe is you don't have no one from the Premier's office, no one from the Prime Minister's office thought maybe we should pick up the phone and call somebody. Nothing. Come on. And then they jump and they go and they say, okay, national emergency. Let's introduce the Emergency Act and hurt a lot of people because they won't move. And then there's other elements of this that are sad. We were told for a long time that Tom Marazzo was a key organizer. Key logistics played a very, very significant role. Logistics, right? I don't know what logistics that was. I guess it was moving the trucks into Wellington so they could all be concentrated in one place. Like you said, like that Salmon suggested, maybe that was his logistics. But he came up February 8th, like over a week after the protest started. And he got a couple flowery positive emails in the mainstream media who were not writing nice things about anyone or with the convoy. They were trying to call Tamara, a Western Canadian separatist, and Ben, they were trying to defame him, and everyone, the whole list. They were just trying to dig up anything. But somehow Tom Marazzo came up on the February 8th, just had a press conference, and all of a sudden the mainstream media was trying to play like very positive spin on who this Tom Marazzo person was. And all we hear from True North and the Rebel for the last 8 months, and Derek Sloan when he's out on the fundraising circuit and he's trying to, oppose the New Blue Party, all we hear is Tom Marazzo, key guy, key logistical organizer, key, big central figure here. And then he comes up on the testimony and all we hear is, in his own words, I played a small role. Wow. Isn't that shocking? Even he admits that he played a small role, or maybe that's what he's saying now because he doesn't want to be under the legal microscope. But why were they all selling us on this idea that Tom Marazzo, key figure, key organizer, cool, calm, collected, Keith Wilson said, under pressure. And, you can't talk anything. You can't say anything about Tom Marazzo because, you'll just be divisive. Well, I don't know. Sounds like they've been a little divisive, starting with a year ago, dividing the freedom movement with another political party. They started that division. And they added on the division by attacking the New Blue Party, leveling allegations against me that were totally defamatory, saying that I somehow was trying to look up a former officer to investigate Tom Marazzo. Like I had nothing better to do coming out of chemo and antibiotics and learning how to walk again, trying to get 124 candidates in place, that I was busy dealing with an actor like Tom Marazzo and what he was up to. This is Tom Marazzo making a video. We got to get rid of the New Blue leader. He was trying to lead his own insurrection just against the New Blue Party, because in Ottawa, he wasn't with the protesters. He was with the Ford government, and then he was coming after me. So that wasn't divisive. That Tom Marazzo's not divisive. Cutting a deal with Dean French and negotiating with Dean French to try to move the truckers, that's not divisive. Going to Canada Day weekend, where supporters of the convoy were welcoming James Topp, and Tom Marazzo decided to yell at them all and lecture them, that's not divisive. But Ben and his lawyer Jim setting the record straight and defending Ben, that's divisive, right? That you can't do. But it doesn't work like that. Sorry, Tom. You want to be a big baller, you want to be a big player in the protest movement, you want to line up with Mr. Wilson and throw people under the bus, protected by the inquiry. Some of us are just going to, defend our clients and defend the movement and get the facts straight. And it's unfortunate that they had to turn to that.
Give that a 10,000 foot view, though, like why that's important, getting this narrative right. There's two ways this can be taken. One, if the government narrative or the narrative that's coming out, it got worse and therefore it's justified. This is the biggest protest, I think, in Canadian history, got international recognition,
right?
Moved the hearts of many, many people. And if this comes out and this is the accepted narrative, how are people going to talk about it in 10 years about this big, massive mobilization of people that just said, you know what, enough. You kept breaking the charter. You kept making life difficult. You didn't seem to care. You wouldn't listen. And we had enough. And they just say, well, it was a bunch of crazies that got out of hand.
Yeah.
And there go EA. How do we talk about that in 10 years if that's allowed to stand? Whereas I don't see that's not what the facts are saying. The facts are saying is exactly what you would expect. You had a massive movement, people from all over Canada standing on the sides of the roads, encouraging people, phone calls, emails, children calling the truckers, hey, thank you for going. Because of the policies, mandates that they were forced through. It affected so many people. They encourage them to get there. You have all these people come into Ottawa. It's chaotic for a bit. And then they kind of get some organization. It gets better. And then there's some actors, it seems, there are people that come in that start trying to make deals with the city. And then basically that deal leads to them being kettled in on Wellington and the mass protests that follow, and all the video footage we've seen of the horses, the batons. I believe it was a Chris Deering. The video came out in POEC of him being beat by police. All this happened as a result of that move. It's important to get this narrative right. It's uncomfortable. I don't want to sit here. It's much easier, much more convenient just to say, well, you know what? They're Team Freedom and I'm Team Freedom. But if the facts don't line up, I think it's the duty of any person that has some character and integrity in them to call it out as they see it.
People are getting hurt, right? And that's what the trigger was for me. People are getting hurt. So We're just talking about one person right now, Ben Dichter, who almost got hurt at the inquiry, and luckily he had standing the next day, and Tamara backed him up in the testimony. And they can't talk to each other because she's not allowed to associate with any of the other individuals that are part of her bail hearing listed, except Tom Marazzo, who showed up at a JCCF award and got her arrested a second time. She's not really able to talk to Ben or anyone else. So she backed him up. But it's not just Ben getting hurt. There are people across Ontario and Canada attended the protest who have criminal charges laid against them. They can't afford a lawyer to defend them. I don't know the specifics of their cases. I'm representing a couple people that have been charged under, let's just broadly say, COVID-related type stuff. And a common theme that keeps coming up is that there was a lawyer on TV, and this lawyer said the protest was legal. And another thing that comes up is, didn't a judge say that the protest was legal? A judge said the protest was legal. And of course, no judge ever said that. It was Mr. Wilson's interpretation of a court order on the honking, where the judge said in one of his statements, the protesters are free to participate in a legal protest. He didn't say that was a legal protest. So the reason why I'm saying this is not because I'm saying it was an illegal protest. It's people relied on that public message from someone that they trusted. They trusted Keith Wilson as a lawyer, and he's a smart guy. Keith Wilson's a really smart guy. If you look back at his history in the legal stuff that he did in Alberta, he's got a really long legal resume, and he's a very smart guy. And people relied on his interpretation of that court order and are surprised that they're either getting sued in a class action or that they are on the receiving end of criminal charges, and those people that they relied on are not there to defend them anymore, and they're on their own. And if we're going to criticize the left, which I do all the time, I criticize the liberals, I criticize the judges, not the judges, but the decisions that come out of the judiciary. You can't also just criticize the judges and the lawyers without putting the right facts in front of them and the right debate. And I don't know which you're looking at, the Edmonton Sun. Well, you know, he's a smart guy, Keith Wilson. He's also very well connected, right? He endorsed Jason Kenney when he was running for leader. He's got a video or a picture with Danielle Smith, the new premier of Ontario. He's a very smart guy, but we got to be really careful in what we're saying to people on our side, because after the fact, they've got to defend themselves in a class action, or they've got to unfreeze their bank accounts, or they've got to fight criminal charges. And it's great to get a lot of followers on Twitter and do videos and say, come to Ottawa, it's a legal protest, but you got to make sure what you're doing is accurate. And they don't want to, those people are relying on you to tell them it's a legal protest. And now 8 months later, they're hearing those same actors say, well, it wasn't that peaceful. It was chaotic. We tried to get the trucks out and we tried to cut a deal with the city. And it's sad. If that's how they felt, why weren't they telling people at the time? Look, maybe this isn't Keith Wilson. Maybe some other spirit is in Keith Wilson's body. Maybe it's another Keith Wilson, and I got them totally mixed up. I apologize. But people are getting hurt, and they tried to hurt some people at the inquiry last week, including Ben Dichter. And lawyer or not, it's important to defend people who are getting thrown under the bus by those that claimed were on their side and claimed they were leading them.
Yeah, I think that's pretty well. Is there anything you want to cover that we still haven't touched on? I mean, there's the Moravian injunction we barely touched on.
I don't think this is gonna, the inquiry's got a couple more weeks. We're gonna see what the last remaining witnesses for a couple weeks are gonna say. I think there's gonna be a lot to talk about for a long time about this inquiry and about the protest. But one thing's for certain. I think it's fair to say that if you look at the original people that were heading to Ottawa, Chris Guerra, Chad Eros, Ben Dichter, Tamara Leach, Chris Barber, There's 5 right there. There's a couple more. I think there was a Miranda that was a director. Bridget Belton. I think there was a Sean. There was a Joe. These are all names on the public record, right? These are all names on evidence at the inquiry. You know what names are not there? Tom Marazzo, Dean French, Keith Wilson. But all we see from the independents is those are the leaders of the protests. They're not. They weren't. They came in after. They grabbed the microphone. They said they were in charge. And now they're changing the narrative and they're changing the script. And that is becoming very, very prevalent if you're on the protesters' side of the equation here and you participated in the protests. Those individuals were not there from the beginning. They inserted themselves somehow. I'm not saying illegitimately or not, but they introduced themselves into it, and immediately they got to work with negotiating the city. And it's weird. The question's got to be asked, Greg. I think, like, what were their objectives there? And what are their objectives now where their Twitter feed and their social media feed doesn't match what they're saying under oath? Because on the Twitter feed, Tom Marazzo says COVID restrictions and mandates and lockdowns have really shown the character of people and how they would be in Nazi Germany. But then when he's under oath, he's doing his best impression of Neville Chamberlain, not standing up to the big bad institutions he says have failed us. And on the Twitter feed, they want to say they're beyond reproach because if anything you say about them is being divisive. But then on the in the inquiry under oath, they just want to shoot away and shift the blame and not take any responsibility. They want to say they were big players, but under oath, they were small, had a very small role, very, very small. Was barely there. A ghost. Was a ghost. There's a lot more to discuss about that, Greg. I think we could do another couple hours just on that. But first things first is we got to help some people out. People that are under class action lawsuits for hundreds of millions of dollars. People that have criminal charges against them. Different people. And they need to be helped. And you know what doesn't help those people? Is stuff being said under oath contradicts the stuff that was being said in January and February from those same people's mouths, and trying to shift blame and destroy people's reputation. That doesn't help.
There's a lot to go through, and you're right. There's going to be a lot more information that comes out over the coming weeks. Prime Minister Trudeau's still up to take the stand. There's a bunch of other government officials that are going to be taking the stand shortly. And then I think it's about to get real interesting in terms of what's going to come out of the testimony and the communications that were being had. And I think there's definitely going to be lots to talk about here in a few weeks. So, Jim, Mr. Karahalios, thank you for joining Diverge Media. It's been a good discussion. Till next time.
Thanks, Greg.